Hello, I'm Robin, and welcome to Bookspin. And today I'd like to do another book review trio. So it's been a little while since I've done one of these, but I've read some really interesting novels recently, and I want to talk about them. And I want to focus on a particular theme, and that is time travel, which is a pretty fascinating subgenre. I've read 3 time travel novels over the past few weeks, alongside some of the other things that I've been reading. So I'm going to talk about those books today. Let's dive straight in. And the first thing that I read is Them Bones by Howard Waldrop. Look at this lovely cover art, wraparound illustration. This was published in 1984 originally. This is my first time to read this author, who passed away pretty recently, and I think this is definitely an underrated one. Waldrop was best known for his short stories, and as far as I can tell, this is the only full-length novel that he wrote. He did co-write another novel, but this is the only one that he wrote by himself. And Them Bones is very enjoyable to read. It's a fast-paced novel. It combines several different things: archaeology, time travel, and alternate history. So it combines these elements into a thrilling story that spans multiple timelines with 3 different narrative threads. And all of these take place in Louisiana. So the closest of these timelines to our own time takes place in 1929, in which we follow a team of archaeologists who are working on unearthing a Native American burial mound. And they make some pretty startling discoveries. They find some quite strange anachronisms in the dig. Horse bones, rifle cartridges, things like that predate the arrival of Europeans in America. So they're wondering what is going on here. They're trying to get to the bottom of this mystery, but at the same time, they're under a lot of stress because they are battling against heavy rain and flooding and adverse weather conditions, which basically means they're going to have to abandon the dig quite soon. So it's a race against time, really, to try and uncover as much archaeological evidence as possible before it gets destroyed. So we've got this kind of archaeological thriller storyline going on. But really, this is just the frame narrative for the main story, which is set in the distant past, and it's a much more compelling narrative, I think. It's actually a pair of narratives, because, well, perhaps I better put it in context. Earth in the 21st century was devastated by a horrific nuclear war. This is what we learn. And so what happens is there's an ambitious military time travel project that's been set up in the future to send a team of soldiers back in time to the 1930s in order to change the course of history and prevent World War III from happening. Why they chose the 1930s, I don't know. That's never explained, really. In fact, we learn almost nothing about the future in which they come from, the apocalyptic war that they're trying to avert, or the technology that they're using to travel back into the past. That's kind of all besides the point, because what actually happens is the experiment is a failure. They do go back in time, but they miss their target by several centuries, and they find themselves stranded in pre-Columbian America. So we learn about this through a series of journal entries that they write and their desperate struggle for survival in a world that they're totally unsuited for and they're totally out of their element. But honestly, that is not the most interesting part of the story. It's the third narrative in this story that is the main focus, and this is the meat of the story, and it's by far the most interesting part of the story, with characters that are actually worth caring about and an entertaining plot. So in this part of the story, it's narrated by one of the soldiers who was sent from the future, and his name is Leek. Only in his case, he gets separated from his colleagues, and he emerges from the time portal into an alternate timeline. It's still the ancient past in Louisiana, but this is a world in which history has taken a very different course. And unlike his comrades in the alternate time stream, Leek is actually much better able to survive and adapt in this new environment. He's a very enterprising individual. He quickly befriends a local Native American pipe maker, and it's not long before he becomes his apprentice and becomes accepted into his village and his community, and he starts learning their language and things like that. And then we learn that it's in this world that an alternate history has taken place. History has taken a different path from our own history in this world. So we learn this through Arab trading missions who make contact with the village. We learn from them that in this world, Europeans never colonized America. In fact, Europe itself is a bit of a backwater. Christianity never existed. The Roman Empire never existed. And in the Americas, the Aztec Empire is much stronger and more widespread than it really was in our history. And it's the Aztecs' war of aggression in this story that is the main threat to the villagers and their way of life. So you've got this kind of conflict going on in the wider world. So it's a very intriguing premise. It sets up an interesting backdrop for the multiple dramas and challenges that Leek and the villagers have to face. And in some ways, this part of the story, it reads a bit like a kind of quirky historical thriller. It's entertaining, it's fast-paced, and it gets pretty action-packed at times. Leek and his pipe maker friend are both sympathetic characters, and there's some good dry humour to appreciate throughout. So this was definitely my favourite of the three storylines. And while it's not the most groundbreaking time travel story I've ever read, it stands on its own as a fun and entertaining read. I mean, if we're assessing the novel as a whole, the other two narratives weren't quite as interesting for me. The archaeology storyline in particular, it did a good job of tying all the stories together, but it felt pretty dry and repetitive. It's basically just a bunch of quite forgettable characters on a dig, theorizing about their finds and complaining about the weather. So I didn't find those chapters very interesting. But they were typically very short chapters. They were just sort of 3 or 4 pages long or so. So it's not a big deal, really. overall, as a time travel story, it's definitely a fun read, and it's worth picking up for the Leaks storyline. If you're looking for mind-bending sci-fi ideas, you won't find them here. The time travel mechanics are more of a plot device to get the story going rather than a focus in itself. But I really enjoyed this one, and I definitely want to check out more of Waldrop's work. So I'm giving Them Bones 4 stars. Right. And the next book I read was The Man Who Folded Himself by David Gerrold, published in 1973. This is a classic time travel story. It's quite a mind bender of a novel. It's written in the form of a journal of a man who inherits a time machine, and it's kind of his reflections on his experiences as he jumps about through time. And more than any time travel story that I've read, this novel critically explores the repercussions that such boundless power could have on the psyche of the time traveler. So it's pretty introspective. It's quite philosophical in its tone, but at the same time it's written in a very accessible style, and there are plenty of plot devices to keep you engaged along the way. So the protagonist and the writer of this diary is a man named Daniel Eakins. And at the start of the story, as a university student, he receives an unusual bequest after the death of his mysterious Uncle Jim. So he gets given a box which contains a belt. And he discovers this is no ordinary belt, it's actually a time belt, which is a wearable time machine. You just strap it around your waist, and then you can use this device, you can program it to go to any date or time in the past or the future. So it's a pretty amazing tool. So what does he do with it? Well, he is a cash-strapped young student. So, of course, the first thing he does with it is uses his power to try and make as much money as possible. So you probably know the drill. He goes to bet on the horses, on the horse races. He goes into the past and makes huge wins on the races, which of course he can do because he already knows the outcome of the race in the future. So Daniel quickly becomes enamored with the freedom and the power that the time belt gives him, and he starts using it for other things, like going on day trips to explore history or to see what the future looks like. This becomes a permanent way of life, and he proceeds to spend his whole existence moving in and out of time. It's almost like he becomes addicted to time travel. And along the way, he keeps on meeting multiple incarnations of himself from different timelines. So he meets older versions of himself, whom he calls Don, and younger versions of himself, who he calls Dan. And strange as it sounds, he goes on to form quite close bonds with these alter egos. And really, they're the only people that he can relate to, his fellow time-traveling companions on his lifelong travels. No one else understands him in the same way. So he sort of becomes his own soulmate, if that makes any sense. It's pretty weird. The interesting thing here is, as Daniel discovers, every time he goes into the past or the future, he is in fact creating a new time stream. So time is not a linear concept, because multiple possible time streams can exist simultaneously. So every time he goes back in time and changes something, he is in fact creating an alternate history that exists in a separate universe from the original time stream. That doesn't mean that the original time stream disappears, it's just no longer the time stream that he's living in. So it's a kind of non-linear multiverse theory of time travel. And this is how the author manages to explain the logistics of the time machine and avoid paradoxes. And it's also how, over a lifetime of time traveling, Daniel keeps meeting countless versions of himself from different time streams. And these people all have different ages, they have unique memories and life experiences, and yet they're the same person, just from different time streams. So it's quite well done, I think. It's well thought out as a concept. It's quite a compelling time travel premise. And while for the most part the story is told in a sort of linear fashion from Daniel's subjective point of view, it's his diary, the actual order of events is all over the place because of this endless playing around with time. So it can be a little bit confusing for the reader, but even Daniel himself, as he admits, he completely loses track of time. At one point, he says, I must be about 39 now. I look about that age. And just to complicate things further, we also sometimes get other versions of himself from different timelines narrating the story and writing in his diary. So you won't find a conventional narrative here, but it's not really a plot-focused novel. There are narrative episodes that unfold throughout the story, but a lot of this book is just introspection, dialogues between Daniel and his various selves, and meditations on the ultimate power that the time belt gives him. And we do get this recurring question about whether or not he really has any responsibility for his actions, since he's able to go back in time and erase his mistakes whenever he wants to. So it's quite a thoughtful novel. It's an interesting read. I think the main strength of the book lies in its intriguing sci-fi concepts and the profound impact that these have on Daniel's life. The time travel in here functions as a sort of philosophical thought experiment. If you're looking for a thrilling time travel adventure with a compelling cast of characters, you might be a bit disappointed. That's not really what this novel sets out to do. But it does have some rather bonkers moments in the story that do add to its entertainment value. It also has a very satisfying ending, I think, that ties things together very neatly. So overall, though, I think I would have enjoyed this book more if there was a deeper plot for me to get invested in and a wider range of characters. As it is, there are very few characters. It's really just Daniel and the other versions of himself, his alter egos, interacting with each other. So ultimately, it's quite a thin story, but it does deserve praise for its bold premise, its philosophical exploration, and some pretty mind-boggling moments. So for what it does, this is a thought-provoking experimental novel that explores time travel in some particularly intriguing ways. So I'm giving The Man Who Folded Himself 3.5 stars. And finally, for my third time travel novel, I read Up the Line by Robert Silverberg, and I definitely wasn't disappointed with this one. This is an immensely entertaining time travel romp with a fast-paced, engaging plot and a very intriguing historical backdrop. There's also a fair amount of humour in this one, some larger-than-life characters, and a ridiculous amount of sex, which may not be to everyone's taste, but I think this is a really incredibly fun and engaging read. So the time travel concept in this case is based around the idea of time travel tourism, which is a pretty fascinating idea, I think. The possible commercial applications of time travel is set in the late 2050s, and time travel is now possible via a process called the Benchley effect. What exactly this means is never explained. It's basically a fancy hand-wavy term to make time travel seem scientifically plausible for the sake of the story. But regardless, this discovery has revolutionized tourism, and it has enabled the possibility of traveling through time using a device that you wear under your trousers, kind of similar to the time belt from the last book. So the act of jumping through time is called shunting. But the use of these devices is strictly regulated and can only be operated by professionals for the purposes of tourism, i.e. guiding tour groups into the past, or for historians conducting first-hand research. So it's in this world that our protagonist, a young man called Judd Elliot, gets hired as an apprentice time courier, which is basically a tour guide to lead tourists on trips to the past so that they can appreciate history in the flesh. In Judd's case, he gets assigned to work in Istanbul, which is, of course, a city steeped in rich history. And the focus of his tours is medieval history, i.e. Constantinople throughout the ages, from ancient Byzantium up until the Ottoman conquest in 1453. So the way it works is he escorts small groups of tourists to specific points throughout the city's history to give them a flavour of each era, and shunting from epoch to epoch, and especially focusing on historically momentous events. So it's a pretty amazing job, for sure, and Judd takes pride in his new role. But the only thing is, time travel can be a risky business, and there are some very strict rules that he has to be very careful with in order to keep things safe and legal and to keep his job and his reputation according to the laws set down by the Time Patrol. The purpose of these tours is to watch the past, not to meddle with it. So in order to not be conspicuous, the tourists have to wear costumes from the era that they're visiting. And they also have to communicate as much as possible using the local language of that time, which they pick up ahead of time via an unconscious learning technology known as hypnosleep. But above all, the time courier must ensure that nothing interferes with the events of history as they're meant to be. Any kind of significant deviation in the timeline creates a time paradox, which must be avoided at all costs. So, for example, one thing you cannot do is get intimately involved with people from the past. And you mustn't interact with doubles of yourself that you might encounter when you're giving time tours, because you've already given time tours in the past. You might give more time tours in the future, and you might find multiple versions of yourself. You can't interact with those versions of yourself. So obviously in a story like this, these are rules that are crying out to be broken. And it's not long before he encounters temptation and becomes besotted with a noble ancestress of his that he encounters. And so there's a kind of forbidden love going on that triggers a dramatic turn of events and all manner of unforeseen consequences, which I won't go into, but I can assure you it's very absorbing to read. In fact, I'll give you a quick taster, okay? Because if you have a look at this edition of this book, on the opening passage, it's got a very brief preview of what's to come. Have a listen to this. What are you looking for in Constantinople? I took a deep breath. To fulfill my destiny by finding the one whom I meant to find, the one whom I love. Pulcheria gasped, crossed her arms chastely over the high mounds of her breasts. It's impossible. Nothing's impossible. A bond holds us together, a bond stretching across all of time. This was fated, I whispered. It had to be. Yes, yes, tonight. When Leo is in bed, I'll come to you. I shivered, thinking of the time patrol sword-like above me. The punishment for unauthorized interference in past events was death. And having an affair with one's own great-great-multi-great-grandmother was about as unauthorized an interference in the past as you could get. So there you go. That gives you an idea of what you might expect. As time travel plots go, it's hugely entertaining, with plenty of twists and turns, and a storyline that gets more and more gripping throughout. The time travel scenarios that unfold get pretty crazy at times, maybe not quite as mind-bending as The Man Who Folded Himself, but it's still pretty mental all the same. Silverberg's characteristic wit and humorous character dynamics make the story all the more compelling. And he's got a great attention to historical details that really bring the exotic medieval setting to life. Along the way, we learn lots of fascinating historical tidbits that add context to the eras that Judd is touring in. Now, I've mentioned the character dynamics, which I found to be humorous and engaging, but this is also something that will put off some readers, probably. None of the characters in here are deep or compelling or even likable, really, but they are entertaining. Pretty much everyone is obsessed with sex. It's kind of absurd, but it's clearly implied that the 21st century that the tourists are from is an extremely sexually liberated era. There's no shortage of sexual escapades in this novel, and sex is a constant motive for everyone's actions, for both the male characters and the female characters. So it's not particularly explicit or gratuitous, I think, but it is pretty relentless. It's not very believable, and it can get a bit tedious at times. The protagonist himself is a massive philanderer. He frequently objectifies women, and he's not a particularly sympathetic character because of this. However, this book is clearly very tongue-in-cheek in tone, so you shouldn't really take it seriously. And I think if you don't take it seriously, it's not an issue. So I think Judd is as much a caricature as everyone else in this novel. And if you can accept that, you'll find it all the more entertaining as a story. The sex is not really a big deal. So overall, I found this a blast to read. The time travel plot, once it gets going, is incredibly captivating. And it's got a really ingenious ending, an unforgettable ending that works really well. And of course, the historical details and the humour make it all the more enjoyable. So I would say Up the Line is definitely my favourite of this trio, and I'm going to give it 5 stars. So that's it. Those are the 3 time travel books that I've read. Let me know your thoughts on these novels if you've read any of them. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.